Comparing Communism and Fascism, Part 8. Terrorism. To bring about the proletarian utopia populated by the communist new men, the vanguard parties needed to seize power and create totalitarian regimes wherein all human life was monitored and controlled. Dictatorships wherein the secret police arrested, tortured, and executed people for the smallest of deviations from the party line. To create these societies, the communist parties the world over engaged in terrorism to seize and/or hold onto political power. This widespread and systematic terrorism is yet another way in which the fascists and the communists were alike. Indeed, it was the communists who had set the standards of mass terror for the first part of the 20th century. As Vladimir Tismanu notes, quote, "Until 1939, most mass crimes in Europe were in fact committed by Stalinists in the USSR." Unquote. From the very beginning, the communists were willing to use terrorism to achieve their goals. This can be seen directly in the writings of Marx and Engels. Karl Marx was explicit in stating that political violence and terrorism would be necessary to bring about the socialist state and the eventual communist utopia. Marx insisted that if the communists did not engage in violence, either the communists would be suppressed or that the process of bloodshed would take even longer than expected. Marx wrote in 1848, quote, "There is only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated, and that way is revolutionary terror." What is important to note here is that Marx is not saying that this bloody terrorism is an inevitability of the scientific processes of history. Rather, Marx is making a statement of prescription. He's making an ought statement. To transition more quickly to communism, according to Marx, the communists ought to engage in terrorism. A year later, in 1849, Engels made a frightening prediction of the future. Engels wrote that, quote, "The next world war will result in the disappearance from the face of the earth not only of reactionary classes and dynasties, but also of entire reactionary peoples. And that, too, is a step forward." Unquote. In this passage, Engels is referring to a future global revolution of the proletariat. During and following this revolution, Engels claims that there will be a veritable genocide targeted against reactionary peoples. Races and ethnicities and religions that the communists deem to be counter-revolutionary are to be wiped out by the future global revolution. What is frightening about this passage is not necessarily the apocalyptic image of the future. Rather, what is most frightening is how Engels views this as a positive good. For Engels, genocide is worth the price for the communist utopia. The present author is not alone in this analysis of Engels' writings on the subject. Lenin himself corroborates that Engels wished for red terror. Lenin describes in State and Revolution how Engels advocated that the workers utilize the state to crush the vestiges of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. Lenin quotes Engels at length, quote, "As long as the proletariat still needs the state, it needs it not in the interests of freedom, but for the purpose of crushing its antagonists. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, then the state, as such, ceases to exist." Unquote. Furthermore, in Lenin's analysis of Engels, Engels is skeptical of a peaceful transition towards socialism and then communism. According to Engels, a peaceful transition is possible, but very unlikely, given how jealously the bourgeoisie guard their power. Lenin writes, quoting Engels, quote, "Engels admits that in republican or very free countries, one can only conceive, of a peaceful development towards socialism, unquote. According to Lenin's analysis, Engels discounted a peaceful transition, acknowledging the necessity of violence in the workers' revolution. Further, Engels believed that the revolutionary terrorism and political violence would be necessary to destroy the bourgeois edifice of society. Marx and Engels clearly wanted to utilize terrorism and violence to establish their political utopia. It should be noted, however, that even without the explicit words of Marx and Lenin, communism as an ideology is implicitly in favor of violence. The idea of global revolution and class war demands it. As Vladimir Tismanu observes, quote, in its emphasis on struggle, the Marxian project sanctified historical violence, unquote. Violence is built into the Marxist project from the very beginning. Besides the violent proclivities of Marx and Engels, Vladimir Lenin was particularly adamant about the use of violence. One could say he was bloodthirsty. Lenin's book, State and Revolution, along with his other writings, are replete with his enamored view of revolutionary violence. Lenin was absolutely convinced that violence would be necessary to bring about socialism and eventually communism. Lenin wrote in State and Revolution, quote, the replacement of the bourgeois by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution, unquote. Once the proletariat have seized the reins of power, according to Lenin, they must maintain this power through violence. Lenin, in a letter to Karl Kautsky, wrote, quote, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is rule won and maintained through the use of violence by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, rule that is unrestricted by any laws, unquote. Furthermore, in order to continue and preserve this revolution, they must use terrorism to, quote, crush with the iron hand of the armed workers the resistance of these exploiters, unquote. The blood that would flow would be veritable oceans. But according to Lenin, it was absolutely necessary. Millions would have to be shot, starved, purged, sent to slave camps, and otherwise re-educated to preserve the workers' state. Lenin writes of the level of violence necessary in State and Revolution, quote, naturally, for the successful discharge of such a task as the systemic suppression by the exploiting minority of the exploited majority, the greatest ferocity and savagery of suppression are required, seas of blood are required, through which mankind is marching in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Again, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of exploited. A special apparatus, special machinery for suppression, the state is still necessary, unquote. It is important to note here that Lenin begins by accusing liberal capitalist democracies of engaging in vicious terrorism. Yet, Lenin argues that such an apparatus of terrorism is necessary for the transition from capitalism to socialism and then to communism. To reach the sunny uplands of the future, it would be necessary to sacrifice millions. But according to Lenin, the price is worth it. Lenin writes, justifying mass murder, quote, we must crush the capitalists in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be broken by force. It is clear that where there is suppression, there is also violence. There is no liberty, no democracy, unquote. One cannot make an omelet without breaking a few million eggs. Lenin writes casually about the suppression, murder, torture, and enslavement of millions of human beings. Yet, he has the gall to claim that not only is it necessary, not only will it set millions free from bondage, but that these actions are fundamentally anti-statist and indeed are libertarian. Lenin desperately tries to grasp these libertarian bona fides by arguing that the targets of the worker state are narrow. Lenin writes, quote, "What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, the exploiting class only, i.e., the bourgeoisie," unquote. Furthermore, Lenin engages in the same kind of special pleading that was seen in a previous video. Lenin claims that the socialist state that is eliminating entire sections of society is actually the exact opposite of the state as most know it. Lenin writes, quote, "Again, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary. A transitional state is no longer a state in the usual sense," unquote. From the very beginning, Lenin and his vanguard were not wary nor naive about the violence and terror they were to unleash. Rather, they welcomed it. The more blood, the better. This fascination with violence, blood, and terror was not limited to mere theory. In practice, every communist movement and regime has engaged in some of the bloodiest terrorism the world has ever seen, all in the name of international brotherhood. This terrorism was present since the very beginning. In December of 1917, soon after the Bolshevik seizure of power, Lenin ordered the creation of the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, also known as the Cheka. This organization was the first communist secret police. Under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka were to root out counter-revolution and preserve the worker state from all enemies. Dzerzhinsky, in his first address as the chief of this secret police, told his audience, quote, "This is no time for speech-making. Our revolution is in serious danger. We tolerate too good-naturedly what is transpiring around us. The forces of our enemies are organizing. The counter-revolutionaries are at work and are organizing their groups in various sections of the country. The enemy is encamped in Petrograd, at our very hearth. We have indisputable evidence of this, and we must send to this front the most stern, energetic, hearty, and loyal comrades who are ready to do all to defend the attainments of our revolution. Do not think that I am on the lookout for forms of revolutionary justice. We have no need for justice now. Now we have need for a battle to the death. I demand the initiation of the revolutionary sword, which will put an end to all counter-revolutionists. We must not act tomorrow, but today, at once." Unquote. The communists claimed that this organization was merely a defensive measure to seek out spies and saboteurs. In actuality, the Cheka set about eliminating all dissent. They started a long and bloody legacy, a mantle that would be taken up by the GPU, NKVD, and eventually the KGB. From the start, the Cheka engaged in their duties not only with alacrity and adeptness, but also with an utter disregard for human rights. For the Cheka, it did not matter if someone was guilty or not. What mattered was whether or not someone supported the Communist Party, or whether or not someone was bourgeois. Martin Latsis was a key leader of the Cheka. He told a group of his officers how to conduct their investigations in 1918. Quote, "We are not waging war on individual persons. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. During the investigation, we do not look for evidence that the accused acted in deed or word against the Soviet power. The first questions you ought to put are, to what class does he belong? What is his origin? What is his education and profession? And it is these questions that ought to determine the fate of the accused." Unquote. The Cheka not only were targeting anyone they saw fit, but likewise deliberately acted outside of the rule of law. They fully acknowledged that they acted outside of the law, and further acknowledged that violence and terror were their aim. In August 1919, an article in the Cheka newspaper wrote, quote, "For us, everything is permitted, for we are the fist in the world to wield the sword, not to oppress and enslave, but to liberate mankind from its chains. Blood, let blood flow." Unquote. And the blood did flow. Between 1918 and 1920, in those 2 years alone, the secret police murdered at least 12,000 people. Some historians cite figures climbing into the hundreds of thousands. Along with the thousands murdered, tens of thousands more were arrested, tortured, and sent to concentration camps. These figures ought to be compared with the old Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana. Formed in 1880, the Okhrana performed much the same function as the Cheka. However, they were much less efficient. Over the course of about 30 years, the Okhrana executed roughly 26,000 people. This number pales in comparison to the legacies of the Cheka, GPU, NKVD, and the KGB. The terrorist behavior, the disregard for the rights of man, continued to be practiced by the secret police throughout the existence of the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, however, it was particularly vicious. The secret police, already adept at the arrest, torture, and execution of individuals, began to ply their trade towards entire groups of Soviet citizens. The Soviet regime believed wholeheartedly in collective punishment. Historian Stéphane Courtois writes, quote, "From the end of the 1920s, the GPU introduced a quota method. Each region and district had to arrest, deport, or shoot a certain percentage of people who were members of several enemy social classes. These quotas were centrally defined under the supervision of the party." Unquote. Stalin doubled down on this approach in a speech in 1937. In preparing the party for the upcoming Great Purge, Stalin advocated for the punishment of not just individuals, but families as well. Further, he advocated that not just crimes should be punished, but any thought that went against the Soviet regime should be punished as well. Stalin told his audience, quote, "We will destroy each and every such enemy, even if he was an old Bolshevik. We will destroy all his kin, his family. We will mercilessly destroy anyone who, by his deeds or his thoughts, yes, his thoughts, threatens the unity of the socialist state, to the complete destruction of all enemies, themselves, and their kin." Unquote. Anyone who Stalin deemed to be counter-revolutionary was liable to be purged and either murdered or sent to a concentration camp to be used as slave labor. If one happened to be, or once had been, bourgeois, or a member of a banned party, or religious, or belonged to the wrong ethnic group, or if one was not amply enthusiastic about the communist cause, or spoke one's mind, or criticized the regime to the slightest degree, or if one were merely related to someone who committed these crimes, one could find oneself on the wrong side of an interrogation lamp. The hunting down of dissent of any kind became an obsession, and terror was the method of crushing it. In this way, quote, "Communism was at war with its own society." Unquote. To the agents of the vanguard of the revolution, All of this was necessary to bring about a better world, a fairer world, a world of justice and equality. This is well exemplified in the words of Lev Kopelev. Born in 1912 in Kiev, Lev Kopelev was a devout and diehard communist activist and true believer in the Soviet Union. He joined the Red Army and became a propaganda officer during the Second World War. After the war, however, Kopelev began having doubts. He spoke out against the Red Army's treatment of German civilians. For this, Kopelev was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Kopelev, as a dissident, wrote about his experiences and how the communists often justified their actions to themselves. Kopelev writes, quote, "With the rest of my generation, I firmly believed that the ends justify the means. Our great goal was the universal triumph of communism, and for the sake of that goal, everything was permissible. To lie, to steal, to destroy hundreds of thousands and even millions of people, all those who were hindering our work or could hinder it, everyone who stood in the way. And to hesitate or doubt about all this was to give in to intellectual squeamishness and stupid liberalism, the attributes of people who could not see the forest for the trees." Unquote. In the pursuit of utopia, anything and everything was permitted. Much like the other characteristics that have been discussed, this widespread use of terror was not limited to the Soviet Union. Rather, the Soviet Union actively exported it to their Eastern European satellites. As early as 1929, the Soviet Union was exporting its ideas of terror violence as a means of pursuing the proletarian revolution to Eastern Europe. Klement Gottwald, a leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, told the parliament in 1929, quote, "You know very well why we go to Moscow. We go there to learn from the Russian Bolsheviks how to wring your necks." Unquote. A direct and verbal threat to the political rivals of communism is rather shocking in how candid it is. In Central and Southeastern Europe, like elsewhere, the first apparatuses of power that the communists were certain to seize control of were, quote, "the ministries in charge of repression, the internal affairs and justice ministries." Everywhere, the communists strengthened their grips on the apparatus of terror, unquote. The Secretary General of the Hungarian Workers' Party, Matthias Rákosi, stated that, quote, "This, the AVO, is the only institution of which we must keep total control, categorically refusing to share it with any other parties in the coalition, regardless of the proportion of our respective forces," unquote. Their main priorities in first taking power was to seize control of the secret police and to use it to destroy their enemies. In many Eastern European nations, sexual assault and rape was used as a weapon against dissenters and their families. In Bulgaria, in the fall of 1944, one woman had her husband arrested by the police. The next day, she was told to go to the police station number 10. She told her children that she would return shortly. She did not return until 1 o'clock in the morning. Quote, "White as a sheet, with her clothes tattered and torn. As soon as she came in, she went to the stove, opened the door, took off all of her clothes, and burned them. Then she took a bath, and only then took her children in her arms. The children went to bed. The next day, she made her first suicide attempt, and there were 3 more after that. She tried to poison herself twice," unquote. The use of sexual violence as a means of repression was prevalent among the communist states. A few family members of the victims of the Kachin Forest massacre faced similar threats of rape unless they toed the Soviet propaganda line. Nor was this terrorism merely a European phenomenon. The communists utilized terror in Asia as well. This can be seen particularly in the People's Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Throughout the Chinese Civil War, the communists utilized terror to cow peasants and malcontents into submission. One Chinese communist guerrilla noted with glee, quote, "We killed a great number of traitors, so that the people had no choice but to continue on the path to revolution," unquote. On the eve of the communist victory in China in 1949, Mao Zedong told the Central Committee of the 7th Congress of Chinese Communist Party, quote, "After our armed enemies have been crushed, there will still be our unarmed enemies," unquote. The implication was that the Chinese communists would follow the example of the Bolsheviks following their victory. The establishment of a secret police force, the Ministry of Public Security, to hunt down any and all dissent. The job of secret police and intelligence gathering was later transferred to the Ministry of Public Security in 1983, yet they performed much the same function as the NKVD or the KGB. What was unique about the Chinese Communist terror was the ways in which it made its victims complicit in the acts of murder and torture. The Chinese Communists described it as democratic terror. Quote, "The whole people were invited to public trials of counter-revolutionaries, who almost invariably were condemned to death. Everyone participated in the executions," unquote. Similar to the Maoist struggle sessions, everyone was obliged to participate. Because whole villages and communities worked together to commit such acts, they were all bound by blood, in a way. They were forced to share the guilt, and as such, more likely to comply. This process continued, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. Led by the Red Guards, a group of hardline Maoist college students, the Cultural Revolution sought to help Mao weed out threats to his power. The Red Guards helped to identify dissenters and revisionists, most of whom were fellow communists, and forced them to admit to crimes they supposedly committed, as well as to humiliate themselves publicly. Some of these victims were beaten, some so severely that it resulted in permanent injury and death. Yet, they did not stop at the mere crime of murder. According to historian Jean-Louis Margolin, some groups of Red Guards, quote, "cut victims to pieces. Sometimes the pieces were cooked and eaten, or force-fed to members of the victim's family who were still alive and looking on. Vengeful cannibalism," unquote. All of this was done publicly to send a warning to the whole society: comply or die. Similar events happened in North Korea. The North Koreans likewise have their own variant of the secret police, the Ministry for Protection of the State, who hunt down spies, dissenters, and other counter-revolutionaries. This organization was deliberately modeled on the Soviet secret police. Millions have been sent to various concentration camps, and to this day there are hundreds of thousands of political prisoners still in detention. The conditions of these camps were discussed in previous videos, yet it is important to reiterate the point. The concentration camps in North Korea are deliberately used to cow the population into meek silence. An Myung-chul, a former North Korean camp guard, describes what it was like in one of these camps. Quote, "Sometimes the executions were turned into a game, with prisoners being shot at as though they were targets in a shooting competition at a fairground. Sometimes prisoners were forced to fight each other to the death and tear each other up with their bare hands. With my own eyes, I saw several atrocious deaths. Women rarely died peacefully. In the camps, death is very banal. Every day, 4 or 5 people would die in this camp of hunger, by accident, or through execution," unquote. At this camp, so many people were murdered every day that it became trite. At a given point, the camp authorities ceased to execute prisoners in public because, quote, killing was so common that it no longer inspired fear and terror, but became an incentive to rebel, unquote. North Korean communists not only utilized terrorism against their own people, but they have also exported terrorism abroad to antagonize their brothers in the South. In 1968, 31 terrorists, trained and indoctrinated by North Korea, laid siege on the South Korean presidential palace, a flagrant assassination attempt that left dozens dead. In 1983, the North Koreans launched a similar assault in Rangoon, killing 16. 4 years later, North Korean agents detonated a bomb in an airliner, killing 115. North Korean agents perpetrated this act of terror in an attempt to discredit South Korea, who was scheduled to host the Olympic Games in 1988. These are all flagrant acts of aggression and terrorism. Communist regimes the world over engaged in terrorism both to achieve power and then to maintain it. Anyone who did not fit the image of the new communist man was liable to be targeted. Fear and distrust pervaded every communist nation. As Vladimir Tismanu observes, quote, the main strength of communist regimes was their ability to maintain a climate of fear and hopelessness, unquote. The communists were quite adept in the use of terrorism and were key innovators in its implementation. Indeed, many of the methods that were utilized by the fascists were first learned from the communists. As historian Stéphane Courtois observes, quote, from the 1920s to the 1940s, communism set a standard for terror to which fascist regimes could aspire, unquote. It is yet another way in which the fascists and the communists were cousins, the degradation of the human spirit.